UPCWGS. This is our Research Dissemination Forum, where our researchers from the UPCWGS Research Grant 2020 will be presenting their findings. This event is part of our Site of Convergence, Weaving Tapestries of Knowledge. It's a lecture series involving different topics in relation to gender issues. So audience members are requested to write their questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, as we are using our webinar format for today. So please use the Q&A function instead of the chat, and we will address the questions later in the open forum at the end of all of the presentations. Today, since we are using the webinar, audience members do not have videos or audio, so please communicate with us through the chat or the Q&A function. So certificates will be issued to the attendees of this event. To get a certificate, you fill out an evaluation form, and I will put the link in the chat later on. And if you want to give feedback, you can also use the same link. So I'll put that in the chat later. To start the event, let's call on the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies Deputy Director for Research and Publication, Dr. Marie Aubrey Villaseran, who will give the welcome remarks.
Hello. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to Site of Convergence, Weaving Tapestries of Knowledge. Now, as Jasmine said, this is an event series that serves as a venue for the open discussion of women's and gender issues. Now, this afternoon's event is a research dissemination forum, which is part of the accomplishments of the recipients of the 2020 UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies Research Grant. Now, the UPCWGS grant started in 2018, and it funds research on women and gender in the Philippines and the ASEAN region. This afternoon, we will be listening to 3 presentations. So the first of these would be through a feminist lens, what do feminist spaces look like during a pandemic? It's a project by Dr. Rowena Laguilles-Timog, an assistant professor at the Department of Women and Development Studies in UP Diliman, and Maritess Cruz, who is the founder of Feminist Media Lab, a media advocacy hub that seeks to amplify the research and influence of feminist voices and imaginations, and to promote equitable, critical, and caring media systems through feminist innovations in media production and community building. Now, the feminist research they're presenting describes feminist online spaces during the COVID-19 pandemic in the Philippines. Central to the research is its methodology. Now, the online, which is the online multimedia storyboarding, a customized method which involves the use of online tools such as a video conferencing application and an online collaborative bulletin board. Now, the second presentation, entitled Impact of COVID-19 on Women in the Informal Economy in Quezon City, was conducted by the Research Division of the UP Institute for Small Scale Industries, or UPISSI. Now, this study articulates the realities and experiences of women in the informal economy amidst the coronavirus pandemic, particularly in reconciling their domestic and entrepreneurial roles. This research was conducted by Melanie Cabotaje, Joanna Rose Laddaran, Bernadette Escoto, Jaylyn Manglicmot, and Jefferson Sumalabe, who are all part of the UP Institute for Small Scale Industries. Now, the third research project funded by the center analyzes how victims of SOGI-based discrimination in the university construct their interpretive and action frames, which guide them in their pursuit of justice and accountability. This was done through an examination of the relationship of their frames with emotions, resources, and the values and conditions among administrators. Titled Towards Justice and Accountability, How Victims Negotiate SOGI-SC Equality in UP Diliman. This research was done by Bryon Senga, a magna cum laude graduate of the Department of Sociology in UP Diliman, where he is also taking his master's degree. He currently works as the SOGI consultant of the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies, and is also the project officer of Babaylanes Incorporated. and Kristine de Torres, who graduated cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and is currently the Project Development Officer in Ideals Incorporated. So I'm not going to take any longer in this. I'm looking forward to listening to this afternoon's presentations. I'm sure you are too. So again, welcome and congratulations to the researchers of the 2020 UPCWGS Research Grant.
Thank you, Dr. Villasiran. So for our first presentation, the one who will be presenting is a research project entitled Through a Feminist Lens, What Do Feminist Spaces Look Like During a Pandemic? Let me read the bios of the researchers first. So Rowena A. Laguilles-Timog is an assistant professor at the Department of Women and Development Studies in UP Diliman. Her research interests include the social significance of digital technology and the internet and its implications for the feminist movement. Her most recent projects and publications include the digitalization of care work, gender and the fourth industrial revolution, and feminist protest online as well as offline against Duterte's brand of populism, as archived in the internet. She has also worked on issues at the intersection of gender and poverty, including women's experiences with a conditional cash transfer program in the Philippines and the women's organized responses to inadequate housing in urban poor communities. She has a master's degree in women and development studies and a doctorate in social development, both from UP Diliman. So her co-author is Maritess D. Cruz. She is the founder of Feminist Media Lab, a media advocacy hub that seeks to amplify the reach and influence of feminist voices and imaginations and to promote equitable, critical, and caring media systems through feminist innovations in media production and community building. Their website is https://femlab, FEMMELAB.org. Formerly trained as a filmmaker at the UP Film Institute, she pursued a career in the creative industry before enrolling in the MA Women and Development Studies program in UP Diliman. She now works as a research consultant and communications specialist for various development and academic organizations. So let's call on both of them to present, and I will be assisting them. Wait a minute. So let me put up the slide. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Jasmine. Magandang hapon po sa lahat. So let me start with our presentation. Sige. So ours is entitled Through a Feminist Lens, What the Feminist Spaces Look Like During a Pandemic. By way of background, our research takes off from our current historical moment. No? Next slide, please, Jasmine. And next. Okay. So this moment includes the pandemic, the government responses to it, particularly the lockdowns, and their impacts on our everyday lives. Also the political climate that tends to stifle dissent, and of course the gendered impacts of all of these. We turn our attention, however, on how feminists continued on against this backdrop through online means, and we decided to look at this as new forms of feminist spaces that need to be highlighted. Next slide, please. Our central question is simply, what do feminist spaces look like during a pandemic? And we focus on the experiences of feminist organizations in creating and sustaining feminist spaces online. Next. Our specific objective is to utilize this customized method of online multimedia storyboarding to analyze how feminist spaces are created and sustained online, based again on the experience of feminist organization. Next, we are guided by three central concepts: feminism, space, and online. So we take feminism as a political theory as well as a social movement that challenges patriarchy. and also in its many forms and as it interacts with other systems. Secondly, we take space to mean a network of interactions as they occur and unfold in specific points in time and place, as they are connected to further and larger, similarly dynamic networks. And when we say online, we simply mean the internet, the global network of computers enabling real-time communication, and thereby a kind of space itself. We have a preliminary theory of how they go together, but as we will elaborate later on, this has evolved as we went through the research. It also bears mentioning that from related literature, feminist spaces, including those online, have the following similar characteristics. First of all, of course, they start with a recognition of the inadequacy or lack of spaces for women and gender non-conforming individuals. Second, they may exist as separate spaces or as part of larger, more public spaces. Third, they involve the continuing process of creation, negotiation, and change. They are not finished products. No? They're not fixed. They are not fixed realities. Yeah. And fourthly, feminist spaces require time, labor, material, and other resources in its creation and maintenance. Okay, I turn you now to Tess.
Good afternoon to all our participants. Okay. So for the methodology, next slide, please. Okay. The design of the study was guided by feminist standpoint theory. So the objective was to privilege the standpoint and experiences of women and gender non-conforming individuals, and also to actively seek to address the power differentials between us as the researchers and our participants. Next slide, please. Also, these are the we were joined by 6 feminist organizations, and we present them to you with their consent. So here are they. Next slide, please. The study is exploratory, innovative, and creative. No, with the physical and mobility restrictions of the pandemic, I know lahat dito as researchers, we had to find some ways to, research, but at the same time maintain yung safety when it comes to our data gathering. So we custom designed a method called online multimedia storing. It combined and modified existing data gathering methods and art modalities, namely photo elicitation, focus group discussions, found footage documentary, storyboarding, and even improvisational theater that would most likely yield useful answers to the research question. Next slide, please. So OMS is a combination of asynchronous and synchronous activities that were mostly implemented within a span of 2 months using online tools such as Zoom, a video conference application, and Padlet, an online collaborative bulletin board. Next slide, please. So here are the some of the output, a sample of the output of the participants using Padlet for the first activity, which is the multimedia text collection. Next slide, please. And this is their output for the storyboarding activity. Okay, so sensitive to the pandemic situation, the study actively sought to integrate care practices in the conduct of the research. This includes balancing their active participation and burnout, and addressing the concern of the participants at the onset of the research. Next slide, please. So for our, we use grounded theory analysis for our data analysis using the 2 sets of data that we collected from the online multimedia storyboarding. Okay, so from this analysis, we came up with 2 models of feminist online spaces during the pandemic. The first model is the process model. Next slide. Yeah. So with the process model, we define feminist online spaces as internet-based systems for carrying out feminist political actions through the application of feminist principles and values in various operational areas of the pandemic. of the organizations at the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So ano ba yung itsura nitong process model na to? Ang daming words. Next slide, please. Yeah, so ito yung the process model that we came up with, no? So this diagram captured the development of feminist online spaces at the start of the pandemic, 1 year in the pandemic, and in the near future in terms of the organization's operations as well as the scope of their community of concern. So let's zoom in dun sa mga components niya. Next, please. Yan. So at the start of the pandemic, feminist online spaces came to mean as a migration of feminist resistance from offline to online through remote work setup and communities of care and safety. So medyo mas maliit pa yung scope ng community of concern at the start of the pandemic. Next slide. Yeah. A year after the pandemic, the organizations came to define feminist online spaces as feminist responses to the pandemic and took the form of online gender advocacy hubs. The spaces provided a collaborative place where the organizations could continue their operations and work with other advocates and communities to tackle the impact of the pandemic from a strong feminist perspective. Next slide. And finally, for their conception or vision of feminist online spaces in the near future, they imagine it as something that would come to mean as an iteration of feminist creativity and resilience by serving as expanded touch points for their organizations and by extension their causes. No, this vision and determination are fueled by the strength displayed by the organizations during the pandemic.
All right. So as a concept, we also were able to come up now with a model. Yan. So see, next slide, please. Our research provided the opportunity to critically appreciate feminist online spaces as a concept in itself, no, and particularly at the time of the pandemic. So the model you see here illustrates how our three core concepts, feminism, spaces, and online, actually relate to each other. So this is our theory, you know, that feminist online spaces is found at the convergence of these three concepts. This is a departure from our original understanding where we centered on space and took feminist as simply a descriptor and the internet or online as simply a venue or site. Yeah, next slide, please. We thus define feminist online spaces as a socially produced and reproduced fluid network of relations and processes created and maintained through a global communication system involving a network of computers motivated by the awareness of and advocacy against oppression of women and gender minorities. Next. With the COVID-19 pandemic as context, feminist online spaces capture, first, responses to pandemic-related gender issues and the need for new ways of working together. Second, the increasing use of the internet and revealing the political issues involved therein. And third, the agency that comes with creating and maintaining spaces. Next slide. Okay, so to further elaborate, no, our data show that with the pandemic, which is characterized by risk of infection, restricted mobility, and others, as the context, first of all, new gender issues have surfaced. For example, some have emphasized how difficult it is now, even more, to reach vulnerable communities, and how new ways of working together are now are really demanded. Secondly, the role of the internet, as well as its power, is emphasized. No? That's why one of our participant organization really is an online service provider. No? Wala talaga silang brick and mortar, kumbaga, na office. And third, our understanding and relationships with spaces have actually changed. So at the beginning, this was also discussed in Tess' earlier discussion, limitations were observed, but opportunities were also explored. Next slide, please. Also, this model emphasizes feminist online spaces as related to but distinct from feminist spaces, which may be online. Secondly, feminism online, which may be specific and isolated feminist activities simply found online. And third, online spaces, which are actually dominated by patriarchal values. Next slide, please. Ayun. So to go back to the to our definition, no, we emphasize that feminist online spaces is a convergence of these three core concepts: feminism, online, and space. And with the COVID-19 pandemic as its context, we emphasize that these different concepts have been changed, have been modified by the context, and therefore together they also created a kumbaga new form nga talaga of a space. Okay. Finally, for our conclusions and recommendations, next slide po. Firstly, our study affirmed the usefulness and even the necessity of a creative and innovative approach in examining a dynamic and complex subject of inquiry in a challenging research context. We were very careful about this. Our sessions, for example, we agreed not to exceed 3 hours, and also the OMS itself had been, according to our participants, interesting and fun, and that also helped in the process of achieving the research. Secondly, in terms of the findings, we want to point out that understanding feminist online spaces during the pandemic entails all three concepts, while taking note of the impact of COVID-19 on these interfaces. Third point, the latter can be understood by taking stock of the process of creating and maintaining online spaces, including sense-making, from which these spaces are understood by their authors themselves. Next slide. Quite obviously, or apparently, from our research, the pandemic was a significant push in the creation and maintenance of feminist online spaces, given the rise of gender issues amid mobility restrictions. But what made these spaces possible was the reflexive resolve with which the organizations work for a feminist social transformation. So very very consistent and talagang nagsistrike from the data. Talagang the organizations pushed to continue their work. Another point is that feminist online spaces in the time of the pandemic highlight as urgent the task of ensuring that online spaces evolve toward being more feminist. If we also imagine the pandemic to go on longer, this is something that we have to consciously talaga work towards. So we recommend for feminist individuals and organizations themselves to more carefully consider the kinds of spaces, the kind of feminist online spaces they have initiated or of which they are part. Finally, as a final point for our recommendation, this study particularly demonstrated the transformative potential of feminism in the context of online spaces amid a crisis situation. And towards the development of feminist futures, this would mean more directed efforts from policymakers as well in terms of achieving universal access to the internet, promoting feminist computer programmers and IT developers, and ensuring the privacy, safety, and security of personal data online. Supporting feminist advocacy in terms of flexible funding per se, as well as maintaining respect for feminist or organizations' autonomy in setting their agenda, priorities, and operations, and support care spaces, the promotion of democratic spaces, and the protection of human rights defenders. So while we appreciate all the work that feminist organizations do to create feminist online spaces, the research has surfaced that the burden, kumbaga, the responsibility, the share in all this work must also be it must be shared by other stakeholders. That's it. Thank you. Our presentation ends there.
Thank you so much. So it's so interesting na how feminist organizations were on one hand affected by the pandemic, but at the same time were able to cope with it and were able to create all of these online feminist spaces. So it would be really, really interesting to track how they develop as the years go by, and it's interesting to see how they've developed as well. So For our next presenter, we will have the research project Impact of COVID-19 on Women in the Informal Economy in Quezon City. So this is a research by the Research Division of the UP Institute for Small Scale Industries. Now, let me read the bios of the researchers. Melanie V. Cabotaje is a university extension specialist at the UP Institute for Small Scale Industries. The UPISSI is a research and extension unit in UP Diliman that exists to promote the growth of micro, small, and medium enterprises in the country. Her research interests include social entrepreneurship, gender and development, and migration and development. Joanna Rose T. Laddaran is a university extension specialist at the institute and serves as director for public sector relations of the Business Continuity Managers Association of the Philippines. She recently received the 2021 Gawad Chancellor sa Natatanging Reps Extension Cluster. Bernadette Escoto is a university extension specialist who has been involved in research projects and conferences handled by the research division as a means to help the MSME sector. Jaylyn D. Manglicmot is a university research associate too at the institute. Mr. Jefferson C. Sumalabe is a university extension specialist at the institute. He performs research and extension functions related to small business and entrepreneurship. He also serves as a coach in the preparation of outputs of ISSI training participants. So to represent all of these authors, let's call on Ms. Melanie Cabotaje, who will be the one who will present their findings.
Maraming salamat, Jasmine. Naririnig po ako.
Opo.
Hello. Yes. Miss Jasmine pa, allow naman po to share my screen.
Okay
Hindi
po.
ako naka...
Okay, sige. Ito po.
Okay. Wait lang. Share. And then... Ayan, nakikita niyo na po ang aking screen.
Yes po, kita po yung screen.
Hindi naman siya naka-presenter view, right?
Hindi naman.
Okay, before I start po, magandang hapon po ulit sa lahat. Wait lang, kasi nag-unstable ang aking internet. Stop ko lang yung video. Okay, magandang hapon po ulit sa lahat. Once again, I'm Mel. Before I proceed with my presentation, allow me to acknowledge my co-researchers at UPISSI. Nandito din po sila sa ating Zoom room ngayon. Ms. Joanna Rose Laddaran, Ms. Berna, Ms. Jaylyn, and Mr. Jeff Sumalabe. Our research consultants, Dr. Rosalinda Ofreneo and Ms. Sonia Narito. And we also invited our research coordinators from Patamaba and Metro Manila Vendors Alliance, sila Miss Marie at sila Tita Flora Santos po. Good afternoon at magsisimula na po ako sa aking presentation. So the coronavirus pandemic has created an unprecedented health crisis and generated a global economic downturn. In the Philippines, as of yesterday, we have 148,000 cases, active cases, 33,000 reported deaths, over 16,000 plus cases every day. Yesterday, it was a record high, yet again, of over 22,000. Our hospitals are already overwhelmed. And as if this is not enough, there are reports about irregularities in healthcare spending. So last year, because of this pandemic, over 50% of our micro, small, and medium enterprise sector stopped operations. And according to a SWS survey last year, at least 27.3 million Filipinos are unemployed. Based on our research we conducted, I think April 2020, the MSMEs are severely affected by the pandemic. There are business closures, employees not being able to come to work due to lack of transportation. They are experiencing cash flow problems and sales decline. In our follow-up survey, out of 585 participants, 67% were not able to avail of the government programs rolled out during this pandemic. And the research also found out that while the goals of the programs are relevant, they proved to be inadequate in addressing the challenges faced by MSMEs and ensuring their sustainable recovery. In this study, we also highlighted the fact that most of the government programs rolled out during this pandemic did not benefit those in the informal economy. So last year, there were also numerous surveys, studies on the effects of the pandemic on MSMEs, and it was conducted by different organizations. But none of them really focused on women in the informal economy. Through everything that is happening around us, we deem it crucial to locate women in the informal economy and their experiences in this time of pandemic. Thus, this research on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on women in the informal economy in Quezon City. Our study aims to articulate the realities and experiences of women in the informal economy amidst the coronavirus pandemic, particularly in reconciling their domestic and entrepreneurial roles. According to the International Labor Organization, the term informal economy refers to all economic activities by workers and economic units that are, in law or in practice, not covered or insufficiently covered by formal arrangements. Belonging to this category are street vendors, ambulant vendors, sari-sari store owners, home-based workers, and registered businesses, among others. According to Philippine Statistics Authority estimates in 2018, there are at least 15.6 million workers in the informal economy, or 38% of the country's labor force. This study employs both quantitative and qualitative methodologies. We did key informant interviews, focus group discussions with women organizations, and the Quezon City government. Our main research participants are three organizations of informal workers, Patamaba, or the Pambansang Kalipunan ng mga manggagawang informal sa Pilipinas, MMVA, or Metro Manila Vendors Alliance, and the UP Manininda. We have 248 survey participants. So 103 Patamaba members from 3 barangays, Sitio Militar, Pag-ibig Sanayon, and Balingasa. Patamaba members are usually home-based workers or mostly into sewing, sari-sari store, food processing, trading, service, talipapa, lutong ulam, or karinderya. And we also have 97 members from MMBA from 8 barangays: Pasong Putik, Kulyat, Old Balara, Old Capital Site, Katipunan, Veterans Village, Commonwealth, Batasan Hills. And they are street vendors, so they sell wet and dry goods, including vegetables, fruits, ukay-ukay. And we also have 48 respondents from UP Manininda members. They sell fish balls, taho, ice cream, banana Q, and sometimes some of them operate kiosks. So all in all, we have 248 participants. And our research study only covers women in the informal economy in Quezon City. So for the profile of research participants, most of them, or 65%, are 40 years old and above. And yung pinakamarami po ay yung age group na 40 to 49 years old. Majority are high school graduates. Some reached college but did not finish. Average household size is 4 to 5 members in the family. And we asked them about their income. 48% of them earn 301 pesos to 600 pesos daily income. 38% earn 300 pesos and below. For their household monthly income, most of them earn an average of 6,400 to 10,800 pesos. Please note that this is way below the minimum wage in the Philippines. And for their housing, most of them are renting. 38% own homes but with no titles. When we ask them how much do they spend for their rent, some of them spend 2,500 up to 6,000 pesos per month. And 23% currently live in considered danger zones. Okay, so for the next few slides, I will be presenting the result highlights. So for the effects of the pandemic, on the individual level, they lost 42% of them totally lost their income, as in naubos, nasaid ang kanilang income. For household level, ganun din po, loss of income 38%, and they experienced varying levels of loss of income, both in the individual and household level. And these are some of the quoted interviews. Nagsara ang sari-sari store, nawalan din ng trabaho mga kapatid ko. Ang kita namin, ang hirap ibalik sa dati, parang bumaba siya ng higit sa kalahati. Kahit nag-GCQ na matumal, kulang pa rin ang benta at limitado pa rin ang galaw, so grabe ang epekto. Apektado ang asawa na natanggal sa trabaho, most of them informal din. Driver, construction, walang regularity ng kita. Lalo na yung jeep, natamaan din ng jeep, kahit na may tricycle sila, may jeep sila, pinagbawal ng gobyerno. So for hunger incidents, 62% of our participants, or that's like, since we have 248, that's more than 150 participants who experienced hunger. And 33% of them experienced it once a day, 20% once a week, 4% once a month. There were 34% who did not experience hunger. We asked them about their means employed to provide food on the table. They first, the most common means was to borrow money, reduce household expenses, reduce number of meals, used capital for household expenses, reduced the amount and quality of food served, and took an additional source of income. So ito sa reduce the number of meals. Some during the focus group discussions, they shared na minsan they skip breakfast, lunch na lang, and doon naman sa reduction ng amount and quality of food, yung mga binibigay sa kanilang relief goods na sardinas, sometimes gagawin daw nilang, lalagyan nila ng sabaw with miswa, yun na yung ulam, and then pagkagabi, lugaw na lang. So that is how they reduce the quality of food. For the source of loans, 5-6 pa rin yung pinaka-common na source of loans for them. And we asked them why. Kasi very accessible for them. Anytime kailangan namin, nandyan ang cash. So walang processing, walang requirements. Some of them borrow from their family members, relatives, friends, and some of the organizations which have active savings and loan program, yun yung ina-access ng kanilang mga members. Adjustments made for online modular class. So they help 22% of them help children with their studies while doing business, while the other 15% of the participants said that children are old enough and don't need help. Another 15% said that the older children help their younger siblings. But some of them temporarily stopped working so that they will be able to help their children with their studies. Overall personal adjustments made. So they did a lot of multitasking. They asked help from their husband or their partner. They took an additional source of income, reduced number of hours of sleep, prioritized family over enterprise and livelihood, while some, baliktad naman, they prioritized their enterprise and livelihood over their family. Effects on enterprise and livelihood. So nandun yung loss of capital kasi nga kung makikita nyo kanina sa earlier slides, they use their capital for their household expenses. And nandyan din yung bukas-sara. This is their term, bukas-sara ang kanilang mga negosyo, mga enterprises based on quarantine restrictions. And also, they have limited operations due to protocols like curfew, physical distancing. So sa livelihood ang naging effect sa kanila, they experienced varying loss of income. Nandun din yung varying loss of customers. Ang iba, ang sinasabi nila, magbukas ka man, kung kulang din yung mga mamimili, kulang pa rin yung kanilang benta. And 71% experienced price increase in raw materials. Nandito yung mga nag-pivot sila, they changed their business. Dati, ginawa nilang essential ang kanilang business, they went into food processing. But then, because of the swine flu, tumaas naman yung presyo ng mga raw materials nila. So, compounding ang kanilang challenges. So, dependent kami sa daily kita. Pag di kami nagtenda, walang kita, walang pagkain. Walang benta kasi walang mamimili. Kumikita lang kami kung may estudyante. This is particular sa mga UP manininda na talagang nawalan sila ng kita dahil nga sa online classes. Nagtitipid ang mga customers dahil nga apektado rin ang kabuhayan nila. Kung dati bumibili pa sila ng dishwashing liquid, Fabcon, ngayon bareta na lang muna. Kung dati kayang bumili ng litro, ngayon sachet na lang muna. Mahirap kasi wala masyadong bumibili, di lumalabas ang mga tao. So their sales is also affected by the loss of customers. Adjustments made for enterprise and livelihood. Some of them increased work hours, while others decreased work hours, depending nga sa protocol and quarantine restrictions. Ito din yung business was totally changed. Looked for alternative source of raw materials and diversified products and services. Ito yung mga dati ang ginagawa lang nila, nananahi sila ng mga kortina, ng mga throw pillows. Ngayon, tinasok din nila yung pagtatahi ng mga masks and PPEs. Challenges in using online sales channels. Hindi ko na nai-include dito yung, meron din kaming question kung they went online and very few of them went online. So we asked them what are the challenges they encountered in using online sales channels. So 37% intermittent internet connection. And they consider it also as an additional expense. Mahal po kasi yung internet sa Pilipinas. So kino-consider pa nilang dagdag kapital. And of course, lack of knowledge regarding the use of the internet. While some of them were able to sell via Facebook, but sobra yung reliance nila sa kanilang mga anak para turuan sila na sa kanilang pagbebenta at paggagamit ng Facebook. Barriers in disaster preparation. Isa po itong malaking advocacy ng UPISSI. We really ask about their practices when it comes to disaster preparation. So, ang kanilang mga na-share na barriers, insufficient knowledge, lack of capacity, capability, and lack of funds. Emotions usually felt during this pandemic. Ano yung usual na nararamdaman nila? So most of them are anxious, fearful, takot, physically exhausted, uneasy, restless. Kasi yung sa physical exhaustion, kung makikita natin kanina sa mga earlier slides, most of them nagmumultitask, they reduced number of hours, they took an additional source of income, kaya talagang pagod. Okay. Assistance from the government. Dismal po ang naging receive nila na assistance from the government. Most of them received food packs, relief goods. So kung makikita natin, hindi siya akma sa laki ng problema na kinakaharap nila. Some of them, 35% received financial grant, but this is sa cost ay around 2,000 pesos. Merong naka-receive na 5,000 pesos. Yung SAP, 16,000, 8,000 to 16,000. So for the QC government programs availed of, local SAP. Ito yung local SAP, ito yung mga hindi naka-avail ng SAP na binigay ni DSWD. Meron din si QC na Kalingang QC. I think this costs 5,000 pesos. And Kalingang QC para sa negosyo. Ganon din ata, 5,000 pesos. So perceived adequacy of government assistance. 87% believe that the government assistance is inadequate. 54% were not able to avail of national government programs. 27% were not able to avail of QC programs. Okay. Road to recovery, challenges and assistance needed. Ito yung mga major challenges na na-experience nila at kakaharapin nila para mas makarecover sila. So lack of capital, multiple financial obligations, lack of buyers, limited transportation, no permanent and decent location for enterprise, insufficient knowledge on how to recover, and involvable and decent housing. Kung mapapansin po natin yung top 3 na assistance sila, something to do with financial need. Analysis and recommendations. So the pandemic exacerbated the condition of women in the informal economy. They are physically exhausted, psychologically distressed, and financially insecure. So even before the pandemic, kasi the women in the informal economy are already disproportionately suffering gender inequalities. Now, because of the pandemic, they are facing bigger problems and carrying multiple burdens. Pandemic restrictions are anti-poor. While the coronavirus does not discriminate, the policies imposed by the Philippine government to contain it can, and they do in many ways. Marami sa kanila yung dahil sa pinagbawal yung jeep, pinagbawal yung mga tricycle, they shared na talagang nagre-rent sila ng taxi para malang makapunta ng Divisoria to source out their material. So dagdag siyang gastos, dagdag hirap para sa kanila. At na-share nga sa isang FGD din na mas maliliit na negosyante, mas na-hit nitong mga quarantine restrictions. The current government pandemic response for the MSME sector is not only disproportionate to the needs of the sector, it is also not gender responsive. So walang mga specific programs for women, specific measures for women. The current pandemic response is also not inclusive. So nabanggit ko kanina na ang mga government programs na ni-roll out during this pandemic did not prioritize those in the informal economy. The informal economy remains invisible. At yung mga funds na ina-allocate nila sa mga programs, even the registered businesses ay hindi lahat ng registered businesses ay makapag-avail, lalong-lalo na itong mga nasa informal economy. The shift to digital remains a challenge because of uneven playing field. While some were in a better position to shift, some are hindered because of lack of resources and capacity. We always include this in our analysis, in our studies, kasi the government has been pushing for the shift to digital. But we have some ease ng ating mga nasa informal sector before sila talaga makapag-shift to digital. General recommendations. Ensure representation of women in the informal economy and their organizations in COVID response planning and decision-making. And we also recommend that to ensure that workers in the informal economy are included in government's pandemic response measures and put in place universal, comprehensive, and fully funded healthcare and social protection system. So we see this as an opportunity for the government, for all of us to build back better and not to go back to where things were before. So while almost all countries have been affected by the pandemic, the health and social and economic impact of this crisis have been far greater dito sa Pilipinas because social infrastructure is not in place and the government has to rely on immediate relief measures. Specific recommendations. We recommend for the government to provide pandemic financial grant to all workers in the informal economy, ranging from 15,000 to 25,000 pesos. Ito pong amount nito ay galing din sa kanila during our validation. Provide grants to organizations of informal workers to support existing loan mechanism like savings and loan facility as a viable alternative to 5-6 lending scheme. Since may yung mga organizations na ng informal workers ay meron din silang mga village savings and loan associations, pwede din itong magamit, mabigyan sila ng pondo para paikot nila as an alternative to 5-6 kasi ang taas-taas ng interest ng 5-6. Marketing assistance, provide marketing assistance through creative mechanisms. So itong mga fresh mobile market, online platform, meron nito ang Quezon City, pero sana mas mapagpatuloy kasi at least nakukuha nila yung mga products ng informal workers at naibibigay din nila sa mga consumers. On digital technology, we recommend that the government ensure accessibility of information and communication technology in the country in terms of cost and reliability. Of course, improve ICT infrastructure in the country and implement programs that provide laptops, tablets, and mobile phones used for business. Isa pa pala to sa na-share nila na they don't really have gadgets, mobile phones na naka-alat talaga naka-designate for their business. Housing and vending sites, since ito ay isa sa mga major needs ng ating mga informal workers, for the government to provide affordable and decent housing for them, but one that ensures access to livelihood and provide affordable and permanent vending sites. We also recommend continuous capacity building and education, particularly on the following areas: financial literacy, digital marketing, food safety, disaster preparedness, and business continuity planning. And we also recommend to improve accessibility of community-based basic social services responsive to the needs of women in the informal economy, such as health centers, daycare centers. Lalo na po yung mga health centers kasi in one of the FGDs, one of the participants shared na kapag nagkakasakit yung mga anak nila, yung mga kababaihan ng usual na talagang nag-stop ng trabaho para mabantayan yung kanilang mga anak. So sayang din nung kita nila, unlike most of us here, yung mga government employees, when we take a leave from our office to take care of our kids, na meron pa rin tayong bayad on that day na hindi tayo nakapasok. Ayun po. Ayun. During the course of this research, naglabas ng bill si Senator Ontiveros on Gender Responsive and Inclusive Pandemic Management Act, and we took this as an opportunity to submit position paper at nilagay na natin dito ang initial results of this study kasi dun sa bill ni Senator Ontiveros wala masyadong mention on women in the informal economy. So we submitted a research position paper. These are my references at marami pong salamat.
Thank you po, Ma'am Melanie Cabotaje. So thank you for sharing the data and stories that really concretize the negative impact of the pandemic on women in the informal economy. So the research got to really depict how much they are struggling and how much they didn't get adequate support from the government. So meron po tayong nag-comment na the results of these studies research should reach the IATF. So that's something that the researchers can also look towards too. So thank you again. So our next project that will be presented is Towards Justice and Accountability, How Victims Negotiate GSC Equality in UP Diliman. So let me read the bios of the research. Bryon Senga is a magna cum laude graduate of the Department of Sociology, UP Diliman, where he is also taking his master's degree. He currently works as the SOGSE consultant at the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies and as the project officer of Babaylanes Inc. His research interests include social movements and peer studies. Kristine de Torres graduated cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. After graduating, she entered the development sector and currently works as a project development officer in Ideals Inc. Her research interests include development studies, human rights, and gender studies. So let's call on Mr. Senga, who will be the one to present their research.
Thank you, Jazz. Okay, I'll share my screen. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to present our research, which we call Towards Justice and Accountability. Basically, how victims of SOGS-based discrimination in UP Diliman negotiate SOGS equality. Again, I would like to thank the Center for this opportunity and for giving us this platform. It was a struggle to fit this in a 15-minute presentation, pero we hope na na-summarize namin yung highlights. So let's start. And the University of the Philippines, Diliman, has always been an icon of progressive policies, leaders, and ideals, but it has often been regarded as a safe and inclusive university to people of diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, gender expressions, and sex characteristics. We even have the Center for Women's and Gender Studies, the Diliman Gender Office, and the Office of Anti-Sexual Harassment, each with their own UP Gender Guidelines and Anti-Sexual Harassment Code, which are being used to combat inequality and discrimination within the university. And we also have the annual UP Pride that has been institutionalized as a university event to celebrate diversity and inclusion. However, LGBTQI members of the community have been expressing their narratives of discrimination which persist to this day, and oftentimes without the intent of officially filing complaints or engaging with concerned offices. I believe this has been the conversation of students and offices across the system in the recent UP Pride series of events. So this paper then seeks to understand why some victims of discrimination, stigma, and aggression would distance themselves from formal redress mechanisms, existing policies, programs, and other services. Despite the university's open campaign for inclusion, despite allies in the administration and different civil society groups, and despite the other resources and information provided by the administration itself. The objective of this paper is not necessarily to provide a direct critique of existing policies, but to dissect the meanings behind the hesitations of victims in order to surface what directions should potential policy developments consider. So different concepts were mainly used in this research. The first one being the concept of frames, first introduced by Goffman as schemata of interpretations, which are utilized by individuals to recognize and make sense of events, frames. This idea was developed further by social movement scholars in their concept of an action frame, defined as sets of beliefs and meanings individuals associate to events which are constructed to inspire and legitimate activities and campaigns of movements. So hindi sila lumayo sa initial definition ni Goffman, but they dissected it further and likened it to ideologies. They showed that frames have at least a diagnosis and a prognosis. For movements, diagnosis would mean an identification of causes of problems or issues. Kung ano yung suri nila basically sa problema. While prognosis would mean the identification of appropriate solutions based on the diagnosis. On a more individual level, a diagnosis could mean an attribution of blame or kung sino or ano ang may kasalanan sa nangyaring problem or dispute, while prognosis still would refer to the appropriate solution but on a less collective standpoint. So this concept will be used to explore the different ways of framing and negotiating notions of gender equality in the university. However, we thought that the hesitations or avoidance is not always because of how individuals frame their experiences of discrimination. So we explored the following concepts as well. Favorable conditions here refer to those conditions external to an individual which invite or discourage action. This is derived from the concept of a political opportunity, which look particularly at political environments na nag-encourage ng use of collective action. These conditions are those which make it seem like there are more benefits or rewards over risks, so it's easier to act on something. But rather than looking at this objectively, and to be consistent na rin sa subjectivity of the concept of frames, we decided to look for the subjective ideas that individuals have on what makes conditions favorable enough for them to partake in specific actions, whether these are filing complaints or seeking alternative measures. So basically, ano yung criteria nila? And the same goes with the concept of resources. Kung ang favorable conditions here would refer to externalities, ito naman yung internal sa scope of control ng individuals or collectives. Mapa-material or non-material yan, having access to these resources can encourage taking actions. And rather than looking at it objectively, hinanap namin or we located these resources as they are recognized. Ano yung mga meanings attached to these resources? What kinds of resources do they value and how do they utilize them? And lastly, we explored how emotions come into play. Emotional responses arise from experiences of discrimination or from the availability of valued resources or yung conditions that they desire. And they may also influence the justice evaluations or the overall construction ng kanilang mga frames. What we decided to explore, however, is, again, to be consistent, is the processing and understanding of one's emotion, which might inform subsequent actions and judgment. So with all these things considered, we decided to deploy an integrative approach, integrating all of these concepts under a constructivist epistemology. Again, this means that the concepts of material conditions, resources, and emotions will be conceived within the realm of recognition. They are processed as they are interpreted and made sense of by individuals, and this goes consistently with the subjectivity of action frames. And consequently, the main research method used was in-depth interviews with students with experiences of SOGS-based discrimination and stigma. This allowed them to have a safe and confidential space to be as transparent as possible. But this also needed rapport building on our part. So let's go to the findings. On the discussion of frames, what we've noticed is that participants carried multiple diagnostic and prognostic frames, which sometimes compete with one another. There were narratives which expressed hesitations from reporting or filing cases because their diagnosis of the situation or what they blame for their experiences of discrimination would not be individuals or perpetrators, but systems, rules, or the institutions in place. So with this kind of diagnosis in mind, they were not able to piece this together with the available procedures within the university, which they may have interpreted as nag-focus solely on individual offender responsibility. For example, they can't name individuals responsible when they are placed in gendered classes or dormitories which don't fit their gender identities. They can't even blame those instructors or dorm managers who enforce these rules. So with these considerations, they feel as parang they're lost on how present procedures can help them. And in situations naman wherein these individuals have people to hold accountable, the options being weighed here are whether the appropriate ways moving forward would lean more towards restitutive or retributive notions of justice. This process itself itself adds to the hesitations participants have over filing complaints against perpetrators, because in some cases, they are concerned on the consequences of filing on the perpetrators themselves. On the discussion of favorable conditions, we have surfaced valued criteria of participants to say whether formal procedures are favorable enough for them to take actions. And ang mga na-surface namin ay one, sensitivity and equal treatment of administrators, LGBTQI allyship in positions of power in offices, administrations, even civil society groups, correctability of procedures, and the sense of urgency. Consistently, if they perceive that partaking in formal procedures can expose them to further stress or trauma or unwanted retaliation, they then feel discouraged to take action. And in some situations pa nga, the existing policies and procedures weren't clear enough to the participants themselves that they can evaluate them properly. So again, they don't act on the matter. There were narratives tuloy among the participants of them constructing alternative procedures or seizing opportunities of their own. Some participants have utilized social media to settle scores with their perpetrators. And while they acknowledge the dangers and unintended consequences of taking matters in such platforms, they found themselves still in these platforms because dito nila nakikita yung sense of urgency and sensitivity from LGBTQI persons and allies who rally behind their causes in these spaces. Another surfacing narrative, which I also want to share, is the situation in dormitories. Trans students have expressed feelings of exclusion and harassment in gendered dormitories. But rather than formally filing complaints to concerned offices, the participants recalled that what they have been doing is informally making arrangements with dorm managers. Because these dorm managers are acting out the rules and accommodating because these dorm managers are understanding and accommodating to trans students. That's why it's easier to work with them. And because of this, they have managed to group trans and queer students in shared rooms. So by doing so, they are able to negotiate safety and comfort enough to shield themselves from the SOGIASI-based harassment and settle their negative emotions brought out by their experience of exclusion, despite yung feelings of discontentment kasi naka-place pa rin sila sa gendered amenities na hindi fit sa kanilang gender identities. And on the discussion of resources, networks, whether formal or informal, have been observed to be valued among the participants. This is because being part of a network means access to consolidated resources like information, which help them in processing experiences and planning action. I remember one participant was only able to realize that what she experienced was discrimination months after the incident kasi by this time, after a few months, she was already affiliated to a certain organization that helped her process and make sense of her experiences. So this also means having some sort of support group, which helps them in dealing with their own emotions. Networks also help in filing complaints and reports because acting collectively helps consolidate skills and address time and energy restraints. In some cases pa nga, despite certain incidents happening solely to a single individual, having networks allowed them to deploy collective action frames observed in their public campaigns and policy advocacies. And lastly, we have also observed the feeling of shame that is reoccurring among the participants. And while participants express how ashamed and embarrassed they are of being subject to discrimination, almost all of the participants expressed this because all of the participants expressed that because of this, they did not want to partake in any form of action, even though their frames could be very militant or even though these people could be very confrontational on different situations. I remember one narrative na nagsabi na kung yung incident nangyari sa friend niya or someone they know, magagalit siya. I mean, it would push them to do a lot of things. Pero since nangyari sa kanya, they just decided to not do anything, not even disclose what happened to their peers. So even the act of disclosing this experience with friends has been very difficult for some of them because of the feelings of shame attached to incidents of discrimination. So needless to say, students with experiences of SOGSE-based discrimination, stigma, and aggression encounter these discursive barriers which collectively explain their hesitancy or avoidance of formal procedures. While we did arrive at certain policy recommendations, I'd rather just provide for now like questions, points of reflections. The challenge now is how do we make use of these learnings? Or what we like to communicate to everyone ngayon here is that given all of these things, how do we frame our policies on SOGS? What do we see as reasons for the persistence of discrimination and in diagnosis? Can we find a balance between responding to systemic and individual manifestations of SOGSE-based discrimination and inequality? And can we accommodate options for different notions of justice? And how do we meet the expectations and values of these students? How can we offset the bureaucracy in place which keeps us from meeting them? And if we already have have yung values that procedural values that they hold, how do we communicate them clearly to say that we have them? Also, how can we maximize civil society networks in our university to aid in reporting structures? How can we learn from these organizations and dealing with the feelings of shame which these students often feel? So again, we think that these are points of consideration prior to potential policy developments in order to make sure that our efforts for equality in the university are truly inclusive of the realities of these students. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Senga. So a lot of the stuff in your research actually resonates with me as an advocate against sexual violence in schools. The things you said about the victims of discrimination blame their experiences of discrimination not on individuals but on the system. So the problem is really the system, and it's what's inadequate is that the formal processes focus more on individual accountability and not on systemic change. So that's why there's a disjunct in terms of the needs of the victims and the processes that provide for the help, the due process that are supposed to like help them, and that's why they avail of alternative procedures. Like, and I like how you framed it as alternative procedures when you talk about social media and informal arrangements, because these things are demonized by institutions. As you know, you didn't go through the due process when the due process is failing them, and I like it that they characterize it at these alternative procedures as having a sense of urgency or having a sensitivity that is not there in the due processes. So, and also that the networks actually help in the filing of complaints. So then when you disclose to a community and then you have the power of collective action behind you, that's when may laban ka sa sistema. So I really found that very interesting. So thank you very much. So now let's begin our open forum. So please add your questions in the Q&A. While we're waiting for people to put in their questions, I'll recap some of the questions that we have answered online. So in terms of our recording for this event, it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So I'll put that in the chat later on. It's not yet uploaded there yet. It will be uploaded like next week or what have you. So you can check our social media sites, on updates on the YouTube video. So in terms of will the presentations be published? Yes, it will be part of our journal, Review of Women's Studies 31.2, which will come out in December. So Ma'am Marby, will that be online as well, or is that printed?
Both printed and online. Ja.
Okay, both printed and online. So you can watch out for that in terms of our in our social media sites. We will also make that announcement. And again, I will put in the chat the social media links that we have. Okay. Yes, and please feel free to share it with your students, the video, etc. There's someone who asked a question for Miss Melanie Cabotaje. She already answered it, but maybe, ma'am, you want to also expound on it for the rest of our participants. Paano po na-gather yung mga data po, and what are the challenges you encountered, especially in the pandemic today?
Ayun. Hello, naririnig niyo na po ako?
Yes po.
So, yung original po na design nitong study talagang online. But when we decided to focus on informal workers nga, and women in the informal economy, hindi kaya yung online kasi wala silang mga email addresses, and hirap talaga sila sa online, hindi nila kayang gawin yun. And so we asked the help of their coordinators, mga cluster leaders. So nandito po ata si Miss Flora Santos ng MMVA. Nandito siya sa ating mga participants. So tinulungan po nila kami na maibigay yung mga research questionnaire. So we printed out and we gave it to them. Sila po yung nag-distribute sa mga cluster leaders, and the cluster leaders sila yung nag-distribute sa kanilang mga kani-kanilang membro. Mahirap po to, at alam po ito ni Miss Jasmine. Ang dami naming delay sa research implementation kasi yun nga, pag nagkakaroon din ng ECQ, syempre hindi mo rin papalabasin yung mga research coordinators. So lagi rin namin sa kanilang sinasabi na mas okay na ma-delay tayo ng konti kesa sa mahirap na yung maalanganin sila, ma-put sila at risk. So yun po. But for the KIIs, we also conducted several key informant interviews and focus group discussion. Ang ginawa po natin ay Zoom, dito po sa Zoom. At some, we made use also of Messenger kasi yung iba hindi nakakapasok sa Zoom. So Messenger po. Mahirap pero kaya naman, kinaya po.
Ayun. Thank you po so much. So, meron tayong next question. What best practices do you recommend in handling anonymous complaints of GSC-related discrimination and or online sexual harassment? So, ito yata para kay Mr. Senga.
Hello.
Hello, yes.
Recommendations on handling anonymous. Ang hirap kasi like parang from an administrative standpoint or even from a human rights standpoint, parang ang hirap mag-handle ng case filed anonymously, no? Siguro what these concerned offices can do. I mean, nagsasabi lang ako ng what's on my top of my head right now. Siguro is to talk about the amount of anonymous complaints na nare-receive nila, and to make campaigns siguro or discussions on how we can collectively address these anonymous complaints. So I think that's for another discussion, pero thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you po. So the next question naman is for Miss Mel Cabotaje. They ask, may we ask if in your study were women informal sector workers asked about how community pantries help them cope with the quarantine restrictions? What were their responses? Thank you.
Yes po. Thank you po sa tanong. During that time na kinandak namin yung survey, wala pa po atang mga community pantries. So, hindi namin siya na-include sa aming survey questionnaire. But, nung na kami ng aming mga validation, focus group discussion, ang iba sa aming mga research participants ay nagsisimula na rin at that time yung community pantries. They were part of the community pantries, hindi lang yung as beneficiaries, pero tumutulong sila, nagvo-volunteer sila sa kani-kanilang mga community pantries, yung mga nanay at yung mga ibang members ng UP Manininda. So kasama sila sa mga volunteers ng community pantry sa UP. Yun yung naging role nila, but no, we were not able to include that sa aming survey kasi mas nauna na yung survey bago pa nangyari yung mga community pantries.
Ayun. Thank you po. Yung next question naman para kay Ma'am Weng at Ms. Tess. This isn't the focus of the research by Dr. Laguilles-Timog and Cruz, but I am interested in your views regarding the use of online platforms like Facebook, for example, that has problematic policies and practices as a means for communication, organization, or information dissemination of feminist organizations. So any one of you po pwede mag-answer?
Simulan ko na. Actually sa research namin, halos lahat ata ay gumagamit ng Facebook. At the very least in conducting webinars or for their online campaigns. And one organization, yung Lunas Collective, actually conducts this is an online helpline na naka-lodge sa Facebook. So as researchers, we appreciate how the organizations see Facebook, social media in general, as a helpful tool. Pero yung natutunan din namin, dapat very aware yung gumagamit nito of the risks and how to address them. So halimbawa, yung isang org, kung hindi ako nagkakamali, yung Lunas Collective, they make sure at the best they can na i-maintain yung confidentiality and privacy ng mga conversations online. Also in using other apps din na free, yung mga Google apps na yan. And so very aware sila of the risks and they do their best to mitigate these risks. Yun. So we're not parang dismissing them just because they're problematic. All of these are kumbaga works in progress that we can all improve on as we use them nga. Parang yun yung nakuha naming sense from the research. Baka si Tess may i-add din.
Yes, and aside from that, so aware nga sila dun sa problematic dimensions ng mga online tools na to and spaces. Pero meron ding mga campaigns specifically sa internet governance na kino-conduct yung ating yung organizations, particularly yung Foundation for Media Alternatives. And when it comes then to ICT parang policy, parang there is an awareness. Pero this is from another project. Medyo nag-intersect na yung Pilipinas super baby pa niya compared to other countries when it comes to yun mga ICT policy. So yung parang mga issue kunyari dun sa mga Facebook, yung mga content na if you're talking about it, yung misogynist content, sexist contents, yung gender-based violence online. So laging talaga tayo sa ICT policy. So that's something that one of the organizations na nag-participate sa research namin is trying to address and promote.
Ayun, thank you po. Yung next question para sa inyo din po. Based on the findings of the study on feminist spaces online, were there any advantage po ba for feminist organizations upon transitioning to using online as a platform to promote their advocacies that weren't there prior to utilizing the online platform?
Ako i-highlight ko siguro, lalo na no, dahil in the context of the pandemic, definitely yung safety from yung risk, safety from the risk of contracting COVID-19 ando, no? So by working online, at least mami-minimize mo na yung exposure ng grupo mo, ng community mo sa COVID disease, compared if they worked face to face or were traveling around. Tapos syempre yung iba no, and these were also parang part of their learning na naging madali rin mag-network, mas naging madali rin mag-build ng partnerships. Yon, may mga ganong advantages. And yung emphasis nga namin sa research, these are spaces that are here. So it's no longer a question of whether or not advantageous ba or disadvantageous, no, yun yung lumabas sa research. It's more about ensuring na kailangan talaga gawin na tong feminist. Mas ganun yung challenge rather than parang seeing kung okay ba to o hindi. We have to make it feminist and it's possible nga.
Siguro to add to that, isa sa mga naging advantage nung feminist online spaces na that was pushed by the pandemic is na parang napatunayan yung parang before kasi 'di ba yung mga parang online activism meron siyang sort of parang meron prejudice na parang mga keyboard activists ganun, mga ano yung tawag doon, yung mga armchair activists, no? Parang with the online spaces, nung doon na sila gumagalaw sa online spaces, parang nakita talaga nila yung potential ng online spaces to parang for feminist organizing, yan, to push forward yung kanilang mga advocacy. So isa yun sa mga advantage nung move towards transition to online spaces.
Thank you. So the next naman para kay Mr. Senga, may we know if the study of Senga and Kristine did a critique of the existing policy and procedure of UPD regarding addressing issues of SOGSE?
Hello. Ayun, as mentioned nga earlier, hindi siya necessarily a direct critique of the existing policies. Kasi yung epistemological standpoint mas nakafocus sa perceptions ng victims, sa evaluations nila of the existing policies. Kasi one might say na yung valued procedural rules na hindi nakikita ng victims ay existing naman pala in the first place. So again, it's more of ang kinikritik dito is yung discursive barrier between yung mga victims and existing policies na hindi natin masyadong na-address. So if ever we can prove na talagang may basis naman talaga yung ganitong klaseng judgments, if talagang wala naman talaga sa existing policies or procedures yung mga napupuna ng mga victims na to, then that would really be a critique of the policies. Pero regardless, no, I think the narratives of these victims are valuable and it can really inform us on how we can further improve existing policies if ever yun ay magiging direction natin in the future. So I hope I answered the question.
May isa pa para sa'yo, what mode of action would you suggest when faced with someone who opted out of filing formal complaints after experiencing SOGSE-related discrimination and or sexual violence? Choices like this are usually well warranted. As mentioned a while ago, due process is usually ineffective. So what can you do instead to help them?
Based kasi dun sa naging results ng research, what helped these individuals carry on despite hindi nagpo-proceed yung kaso nila, or siguro hindi sila nag-decide to file a case, ay yung having networks, yun nga, having civil society networks, kasi parang dito ka nagkakaroon ng access to different ways of processing your emotions, no? If you can't at least hold your perpetrator accountable, or at least not for now, at least what you can do is itong mga victim na to, they are placed in such spaces wherein they could heal, no? And then siguro within these spaces mas nakakapag-recalibrate sila and decide on what directions to take to take forward yan.
Thank you po. So, yung next question, for the presenters, to what extent is your study informed by the feminist principles of the internet? Does it touch on all the principles, or are there specific ones that particularly resonated with the COVID context in the Philippines? So, I guess if all it's more of kay Ma'am Weng, and pwede din kay Ms. Cabotaje, but if Mr. Senga also has some thoughts, pwede din siya mag-add. Sige po, Ma'am Weng, kayo po.
Oo, we were able to to see yung sa feministinternet.org. Pero we decided not to adopt parang complete or ready na framework in analyzing the data. Actually, karamihan din sa mga nahanap naming mga previous literature are in the international context, usually West. So sabi namin, at most they're a guide, no, when we analyze na, pero we didn't really parang use them to frame the data. So we tried our best na maging bottom up yung analysis, maging very grounded nga. Therefore, ganun yung naging turnout ng aming analysis. So if particularly dito sa feminist principles of the internet, no, we didn't have particular bias towards it.
Okay. Thank you po. Sige po. Meron daw question sa chat, although hindi ko po mahanap. Pwede, ito yun. So kay Ma'am Weng and Tess din po, are men welcome in online feminist spaces?
Ako naman ba? Sige. So isa yan sa mga parang lumabas na sub-themes dun sa research namin, sa findings, yung parang boundary setting when it comes to online spaces. So when it comes to yung mga kasali, sino ba yung mga kasali dito? It depends on dun sa agenda ng organization. So for example, one organization, talagang LGBT individuals and women lang yung parang welcome sa space nila with the recognition na for the longest time walang espasyo or marginalized yung LGBTQ individuals in the Philippine context, gano'n. And meron namang mga organizations na parang per event yung negotiation or boundary setting nila when it comes to their spaces. Like for example, if may mga members na parang may apprehension in opening up the spaces to women, kunyari mga previous mga victim survivors of gender-based violence, then nine-negotiate if you open ba yung space for men, for cis men ba? Yan. Ma'am Beng, may dagdag ka ba?
May dagdag ako. Yung nakita din kasi namin dating debate sa data na na-affirm yung findings from related literature is that yung feminist online space, isang key characteristic niya is talaga siya, nagbabago siya. Changing at always nine-negotiate. So tulad nga ng mga sinabi ni Tess na example. Tapos actually, I remember distinctly, no, may isa tayong org na nag-share na sila mismo pinoproseso nila yung tanong hanggang kanino ba, hanggang, di ba, hanggang sino ba yung pwede nating gawing member, ganun ka, kakadirekta, or at what level. So it's for the different organization, it's an ongoing question. Tapos parang generally, pag tinignan mo yung katangian, when you zoom out of the experiences, talagang lagi nga siyang ine-negotiate, nagbabago for the different for different situations nga din.
Tapos
So
when it
kung
comes...
sasagutin mo yung question na yan, parang conditional. Oo. Pero ang maganda, hindi ini-ignore yung tanong. Diba?
True. Tapos aware sila na parang may ganong klase ng negotiation. Pero aside from parang yung access ng men sa feminist spaces, sobrang matingkad din sa research na lagi nilang pinoproblema na with the online space, merong mga pwedeng ma-marginalize na mga communities, lalo na yung mga walang access sa internet. No? So, pero meron silang mga strategies na ginagawa para mas maging inclusive na naman. Like parang yung one, or meron silang parang communication hub dun sa isang urban community, no, na dun sa communication hub na yun, dun ginagawa yung mga activities na online, kunyari via Zoom, tapos yung mga members ng community na dun sa espasyo na yun, na dun sa community. Tapos may isa naman na para ma-reach yung mga nasa geographically disadvantaged areas, no, nagko-connect sila dun sa mga community mobilizers, lalo na sa mga probinsya, ganun yung mga strategy nila.
Thank you po. So as of right now, wala pang mga additional questions. So let's just wait for a while. Kasi meron pa tayong time to get questions. Pero I'll just review some of the announcements. So in the chat, you can see an evaluation form. So if you want to give us feedback, please click on that link. And it's also the same form that you need to fill out in order to get a certificate. So after you filled out the evaluation form, usually you can wait around a week and you'll be sent an e-certificate. And to follow up about your e-certificate, you can email research.cwgs@up.edu.ph. So that is all in the chat. So for our announcements on our future events, that's in our social media pages, I also put it on the chat, and the recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, which I also put in the chat. So siguro po one round po tayo ng from the research. Anong key learning ang gusto nyo na tumatak sa mga tao based on all the data that you've gathered so far? May question tayo na ano. Ay, okay. Ayan. Maybe simula tayo from as yung sila Ma'am Weng or ano.
Ako siguro, feminist online spaces are here. They exist. So let's support them. Yun lang talaga yung sa akin. I don't know, Tess, kung may idadagdag siya.
Siguro dahil parang yung focus ko dun ay sa yung methodology, no. Pero parang nakita namin yung parang potential ng mismong online conduct of research to reach yung mga previously parang inaccessible na mga research cohorts as researchers. For example, meron kaming mga participants na Visayas na gano'n. So kasi nasa Metro Manila kami. So parang nakita rin namin yung potential. Of course, with the acknowledgement na meron din siyang limitations. Pero as kasama nung nung parang nakita ng mga orgs yung potential ng online spaces in their feminist activism, nakita rin namin yung potential ng online spaces for feminist research.
Thank you. Si Ma'am Melanie naman po.
Hello. Sa key learnings, siguro yun na nga, women in the informal economy are really facing multiple burdens. At yun yung sinabi ko nga kanina na even before the pandemic, talagang grabe na yung na-experience nila na gender inequalities. Being a woman and being members of the informal sector. At grabe yung naging yung pag-worsen ng kanilang sitwasyon dahil sa pandemyang ito. And really crucial yung government support at crucial na para sa atin, sa mga researchers and even institutions like UPISSI, na mailabas talaga, maging ma-amplify ang kanilang voices at mailabas yung realities na nararanasan nila ngayon for them to be able to get the support that they really need to be able to survive and sustain their operations, their enterprises, and yung maging maayos yung kanilang buhay. Ayun lang po. Thank you.
Thank you po, ma'am. Sige, Bryon.
Hello. Siguro for me, there's value in looking at the subjective meanings na pinanghahawakan ng mga victims. Kasi syempre wala namang kaso kung wala sila, kung walang magpa-file. So if we really want to help these people, if we are really true to our principles of inclusivity, we should always listen and learn from their experiences, especially yung mga alternative mechanisms, yung informal arrangements na ginagawa nila. What can we take from these experiences? We should reflect on that, basically.
Okay, thank you so much. Since wala na nag-a-add sa question and answer, I think we can end the event. So thank you so much to our researchers and everyone who attended our event. Again, please look at the chat regarding our reminders in terms of our certificates and updates and the feedback form. And that's it. Congratulations to all of our researchers for a job well done. And thank you again, everyone, for being here.
Salamat.
Thank you po.
Thank you po. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, and wait for their articles in the upcoming journal issue.